Neil Morris. Neil may well be known to lots of you for his work in digital education, which has been widely regarded. He was previously a Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Leeds University. So Neil, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Can you just confirm that you can hear me and see the slides before everybody disappears? That's great. Thank you ever so much. Well, feel free to turn cameras off. I appreciate it's the evening and you have other things to do. So please don't feel that you need to give me FaceTime. I'm perfectly used to speaking to a blank screen recently, particularly. Just before we start, two potential apologies for things that may happen. One, I'm recovering from a chest infection at the moment, so may develop a fit of coughing, which means I will just have to stop briefly. And the second thing is to try to ensure good quality bandwidth. I'm sat closest to the router, which is actually on the dog's chair. So there's a potential he may come and take his domain at some point, and that has happened. It does happen quite regularly. But anyway, without further ado, thank you again for joining us. Aaron and Michelle have given fantastic introductions to why we've come together, and I hope this will be a useful conversation. It really is intended to be a discussion, so I want to get through my brief presentation as quickly as possible. I'm not going to go into any detail really at all, just I want to give some introductory remarks to stimulate discussion. I'm hoping that the things that I say will be things that you want to hear more about in the conversation that follows, and I'm sure we all have that experience of finding the richness coming out of the conversation rather than somebody's presentation that might not be the thing that you've come for. So what I want to do, and I am going to speak as close to 10 minutes as possible, is three things really. Talk a little bit about digital transformation, as Michelle has alluded to, and what it means to us and how it is impacting us, and particularly focusing in on how and why data is such a critical element of our digital transformation. Secondly, to hopefully not have to really convince you, but maybe just remind and contextualize why I believe learning analytics are so important for our students, for our staff, and for the wider sector and our institutions generally. And then to talk a little bit from experience about what I think, not just from my own personal experience from looking across the sector, of what makes for a successful implementation of a learning analytics institutional implementation, and to think about where you are under that journey, as Michelle mentioned, and what maybe some of the challenges are that we can come up in the discussion. So digital transformation is a controversial phrase. It's certainly not new. Higher education wasn't using it until COVID, but it's been around in business for a very long time. I've always used this definition because I think it rightly focuses on the fact that digital transformation is really about people. It's about people's willingness to adapt and to change, and for organizations' willingness to take their people and their workforce on a cultural change, and to shift really and transform the way in which the whole institution and the whole value proposition is considered through the use of technology. And you notice that I purposefully used the word technology last in that description of digital transformation. It really, for me, is about people and culture. It's about the way in which we reimagine the way that our organizations can support learning and provide better access to education. And technology undoubtedly has a role to play in that. But unfortunately, many people have been too technocentric and techno-focused and putting technology in front of much more important things. So I want to kind of put out my stall that digital transformation is about a cultural shift within the organization. The second definition I want to give, just in terms of context, is what is learning analytics. And I'm I don't want to spend any time on this, but the reason for putting this in was to do two things really. Firstly, to point you to SOLAR if you're not aware of them. The Society for Learning Analytics Research has actually been around almost for 10 years now, and it has some of what I would consider the most, well, that certainly includes the world leading scholars and people who are thinking about the impacts of learning data and the complex interactions between learning data and student outcomes. And I would strongly encourage you and your organizations to engage with this organization, because I think, as I say later, one of the most important aspects of learning analytics is having a kind of research and evaluation theme running alongside any implementation of learning analytics in your organization. It's not enough for learning analytics to be implemented as a kind of an IT project. This is something much more deeply fundamental to the way the organization operates, and having a research angle to this, I think, is absolutely critical. So I said my second question was, why does learning analytics matter? Those of you that have kind of followed the journey of learning analytics over the last decade will have noticed the kind of shift in the answer to this question. Traditionally, it was seen as a means to support retention, and as such, a large number of organizations in the UK and across the world kind of ignored it because they said, oh, we don't have a retention problem. We know where our students are, and we've got good retention rates, and we don't need to worry about this. That was always kind of misguided in my view, but I think there had to be an evolution, and the evolution has come now where people have seen that having this rich learning analytics data set really is having a much broader set of benefits for students, for staff, and for institutions. And I purposefully put students at the front of the queue in terms of why we should be using learning analytics data. There's certainly a whole range of different reasons why students can benefit from having more access to the data that is being generated around their interaction with the organization, not least in terms of providing a more inclusive learning environment for them, providing a learning community between themselves and their academic tutors and pastoral support, and also supporting them to reach the goals and outcomes that they're looking for. So from a student perspective, what they've come to university for can be really enriched by having access to a learning analytics data set. From the institution's perspective, and in terms of their role of supporting students, learning analytics can really support the idea of providing well-being and pastoral support, and that is critically important. The wider benefit to the institution that isn't yet really being realized by very many organizations is that these data sets hold, I think, a treasure trove about the way in which we deliver our curricula, both from a learning and teaching perspective and from an assessment perspective. And I think those really smart institutions are really thinking in an integrated and strategic way about how learning analytics can really support individual students, cohorts of students, and the whole institution learning and teaching mission. So these are just some of the use cases that I would see for learning analytics. We've talked a little bit already about students, and it's really, really important that they are at front of mind and front of your focus, I believe, in terms of enabling learning analytics to support their independent study. They should be able to access a view of how their study is going, how it's predicted to go, and how they could benefit from different approaches, and if they choose to look at the way in which other students are studying to give them ideas about how they might improve their own outcomes. And this is probably the most important use case in my view. The second one is around academic and pastoral support. This is a very common use case for learning analytics, increasingly being seen as a valuable way in which academic tutors can provide a richer support package to students, particularly as the beginning of a conversation. It's hugely important that we don't see learning analytics as any kind of replacement for face-to-face or in person, or however we want to describe the mode, but actual conversation. The data can be there to provide an overview, but it will never really ever get to the bottom of what is facing the challenges facing any individual student. So it should only ever be seen as the beginning of a conversation. Thirdly, I think it's really important that we do start to look at the ways in which learning analytics data can be used to reduce the inequalities that are arising as a result of our curricula and our assessment. And as I said, this I think is a treasure trove for us in the future. People are starting to use these data sets to identify awarding gaps, but actually what now really needs to happen is to look deeply into these data sets to see how teaching and assessment is being approached differently by different types of students, and the outcomes that are being achieved by them as a result of the way in which these curricula have been designed and delivered. And finally, I put regulatory compliance at the bottom of the list as an important role that learning analytics does play. It can help institutions to provide data to external agencies and for their own internal strategic planning and for management information, but it absolutely, in my view, should not be the priority for taking this activity forward. So finally, just a few words on what I think are the kind of essential elements of how to get through an implementation such as this. I think most of these are common sense, but they bear repeating. It's not a coincidence that I start with saying it's really important that there is a strong vision and strategy and leadership behind this. And I mean executive leadership, and I mean really clear, purposeful strategy. It's been obvious to me that a lot of people have got into learning analytics without being clear why. Often taking a follower approach, saying this is something that we need to do, it needs to be part of our value proposition, but we don't understand why we're doing it. This has led to some really serious issues in organizations where students have been enraged, quite rightly, by the unethical use of their data. So the second most important element is, in my view, to have a really open, honest and transparent debate with students before any kind of technology implementation is considered about the ethics and the transparency of the data that's being used and how it's going to be used within any kind of learning analytics system and what kind of outcomes those data are going to have for students. So having really clear objectives and the outcomes that have been designed, shared with students, staff, the organization more broadly, before any kind of conversation is had about technology is, for me, the most important thing that can be done. And then, of course, you do need to have a technology roadmap, and that needs to sit within a wider data strategy. Increasingly, people are thinking about all the types of data that are available within organizations, and it can feel quite overwhelming. So starting with learning analytics, but making sure it is part of a wider strategy is a way to introduce learning analytics in a phased way. And particularly then embedding learning analytics into the relevant processes that exist within the organization. There's no value, in my view, of having it seen as something completely separate. Processes need to change. So for example, academic and pastoral tutoring, it needs to change to embed learning analytics data, otherwise there'll be no buy-in from staff or students. And finally, as I've said earlier, I think it's really important to embark on a research evaluation stream associated with learning analytics in your organization that sits separate to the implementation activity, and also to have specialized staff who are trained and work specifically on any sensitive data that you choose to gather and collect within your learning analytics data. It's really important. I think we should talk about this as much as possible to separate out the types of data within your learning analytics data set to be sure that the right people are seeing the right data and that you're processing it and using it for the most appropriate purposes. So that's, as I said, a whistle-stop tour just to provoke discussion, really. I wanted to stop as quickly as possible. There's a few extra slides for you for afterwards if you want to have a look at them, but they'll be circulated. But I really did want to spend as much time as possible in the discussion session, and I know people will want to leave, so we'll make sure that those that are leaving get to have their voices heard as quickly as possible.